As I said, our focus this evening is on Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We continue to make progress through this very challenging yet so very practical book. And we're getting near to the end of the weighty things that Solomon treats in this particular challenging book. And in coming to chapter 9, we're faced with, again, some very hard lessons, some lessons that matter for both life and death. But before we get into Ecclesiastes chapter 9, I think it would be helpful to step back for just a moment and look at some of the history of the interpretation of Ecclesiastes in general, because it relates specifically to a portion of this chapter that we will look at in detail in a few moments, verses 7 to 9. But when it comes to the interpretation of Ecclesiastes, there's one early church theologian that really has left a mark on the church's understanding of Ecclesiastes. And that individual was Jerome, who lived from about 342 AD to around 420. And of course, we know Jerome as that early church theologian who was also a translator and who took the Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament and produced from that a Latin version called the Vulgate. And beginning at his time then in the 5th century, all the way up until the Reformation, the Latin Vulgate really was the version of the church. Now, Jerome is connected to Ecclesiastes in particular, more than just because he translated that book into Latin. He is known for choosing the Latin term vanitas to translate the Hebrew term hebel. Now, we looked at this all the way back at the beginning of our study. The term hebel appears in the book of Ecclesiastes dozens of times. It is the key term that really summarizes so much of the contents of this book. When we look at that term hebel in that original Hebrew context, it has the idea of vapor. It has the idea of breath, and communicates that at a very simple level. It communicates that of fleetingness, of brevity. But Jerome, in his translation, took a more pessimistic term in the Latin, and he chose the term vanitas, from which we get our term vanity. And so instead of saying brevity of life for Jerome, the communication or the message of Ecclesiastes was that life is vain, with a decidedly negative tone, a pessimistic tone. And from Jerome's time on, the book of Ecclesiastes began to be looked at in a very negative light. Not so much that it itself was negative, but that it described life in very negative terms. In fact, Jerome himself produced a commentary on Ecclesiastes, which also was very, very influential, particularly in establishing the concept of the monastic life. As he read Ecclesiastes, he believed that it called the child of God to asceticism, to renounce the things of this world, that which was material and physical in the world was something of a snare, something that was inherently a distraction, something that wasn't inherently good due to sin's corruption. To get this, Jerome used an allegorical method of interpretation, an approach which spiritualized the text. And when Solomon speaks in these certain instances, what we call the carpe diem texts of Ecclesiastes, when he calls upon us to seize the day, and we're going to look at one of those this evening in Ecclesiastes 9, when Solomon calls upon us to seize the day and to enjoy the bread that we eat and to enjoy the married life that God gives and so on and so forth, Jerome allegorized that and saw that instead as a reference to the sacraments, as a reference to the Eucharist, and instead, because of his allegorical method, he pushed the church towards a life of monasticism, a life which viewed marriage as somehow inferior and that separated laity and clergy because the only vocation that was worthy and glorifying to God was the vocation of ministry, formal full-time ministry in the church. Jerome's handling of the book of Ecclesiastes became the mainstay all the way up until the Reformation. During the Reformation, a literal approach to the Bible was recovered. And although many people don't realize this, the book of Ecclesiastes did play a significant role in the changes that came about from the Reformation. Not so much in those grandiose theological arenas, but in the practical ones. As the Reformers applied a more simple and literal approach to the book of Ecclesiastes, they realized that Solomon is not giving instruction that is pessimistic about this world. Instead, Solomon is calling upon us to enjoy the things of this life that God gives to us and to enjoy them to the glory of God. It is through that focus of the Reformation, then, that the whole concept of vocation, that anyone's work can be done to the glory of God. The Reformers also recovered the beauty of marriage and that there is no inherent holiness in remaining single. And all the other things that we will look at this evening as it relates to the material things of this world and enjoying them in the fear of God, the Reformers helped us recover. And it's with that we turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Solomon is going to give us another one of these carpe diem texts in verses 7 to 9 with another statement tacked on in verse 10. He's going to call upon us to run hard after enjoyment. He's going to call us to work hard at enjoying the things of this life. And he's going to implore us to steward our lives well in light of the fact that life is indeed hebel, brief, a vapor. But as he calls upon us to enjoy life, he also has to remind us of some of the more painful things, which if we do not understand, we will not properly apply his exhortations to enjoy. So he teaches us matters in this chapter pertaining to death and to life, matters pertaining first of all to a right appropriation of the truths of death and adversity, so that then we can enjoy this life in the appropriate way. In particular, he's going to teach us 5 lessons here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, which are very important as it relates to death and life. First of all, he's going to teach us to rest in the sovereignty of God, verse 1. He's going to teach us to reflect upon the certainty of death in verses 2 through 6. He will teach us to rejoice in the gifts of life in verses 7 through 10, to recognize the uncertainty of outcomes in verses 11 to 12, and then to recall the parameters of wisdom in the final verses of this chapter. Let's look at the first of these lessons, these matters. He calls upon us to rest in the sovereignty of God. This is what he says in verse 1. For I have taken this to my heart and explain it, that righteous men, wise men, and their deeds are in the hand of God. Man does not know whether it will be love or hatred. Anything awaits him. In many ways, we could look at verse 1 of chapter 9 as the contents of Ecclesiastes in a nutshell. It really summarizes so much of Solomon's intention in writing this book, to help us understand in the midst of adversity, in the brevity of life, in dealing with the bent circumstances of life, that we are to recognize that it is the righteous, those who are wise, who are in God's hand. He begins verse 1 by saying, "For all this I have taken to my heart." And what is he referring to? Well, immediately in the context, it brings us back to verses 16 and 17. And if you think back to our last time of study, we looked at those particular verses and saw that in chapter 8, verses 16 and 17, Solomon is teaching us to walk by faith. Why? Let's read those verses. "When I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on earth, even though one should never sleep day or night, and I saw every work of God, I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise men should say, I know, he cannot discover." What Solomon was emphasizing there is as he studied all of life and saw all the variegated circumstances, the unpredictability, the adversity and prosperity, all mixed together, Solomon said it's impossible from wisdom's perspective to answer all of life's enigmas. You can't do it. He emphasizes that and says, as a result, we need to walk by faith. We need to trust. And he picks up that same idea, as he so often does, as he moves from section to section, now in the beginning of chapter 9, picking up that same idea that all this, all that he has studied, all that he just referred to, all those circumstances of life, he's taken them to his heart. This is not just mere intellectual awareness, but in the Hebrew mind, the heart is mission control center. It is the center of being. Solomon has taken them into the depth of his being. And what has he taken in? He has taken in this fact that righteous men, wise men, and their deeds are in the hand of God. He's making an assertion here that deals with one particular group of people. Now, he's not denying the fact that all humanity is under the sovereign control of God. He's not denying that. Instead, he is using an idiom here to express God's special relationship to a particular category of people. Who are they? They're the righteous ones, the wise ones. And everything involved in their lives, Solomon says, that these are in the hand of God. Now, especially when we look at the Old Testament, that metaphor of being in the hand of God, we know God does not have hands, but to be in the hand of God means to be in his sovereign control. Proverbs 21 verse 1 says that the king's heart is like water. They're like channels of water in the hands of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he wishes. To be in the hand of God means to be contained within his power, within his activities. But it is more than just a reference to sovereign control. To be in the hand of God also is a reference to be in good care. You probably remember 2 Samuel 24, verse 14, when the prophet Gad reprimands David for sin and gives David a choice as to how the consequences will be meted out in his life. And David says this, "I am in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great. But do not let me fall into the hands of men." The reference to the hand of God here, then, as we look at it in Ecclesiastes 9, is a reference to that careful control from a benevolent and all-wise God. And why is it so important to reflect upon this, to rest in this reality? It is because, as Solomon states in the second half of verse 1, man does not know what awaits him. You cannot know the future. As good as you may be at predicting movements and prognosticating currents and trends, you don't know the future. You don't know what awaits you. He says here, we don't know whether it's love or hatred. And again, Solomon is using idiomatic language to refer to prosperity or adversity. What awaits us on that experiential level, on that emotional level as we go through life? Is it love or hatred? Is it prosperity that is on our path, or is it adversity, sorrow, loss, pain? Is it straight circumstances, or will it be those bent circumstances that no one can straighten? We don't know. And so Solomon begins here by saying you must rest in God's sovereignty. You must rest in His benevolence. His sovereignty to the righteous one, His sovereignty to the one who fears Him, is a benevolent, wise, gentle kind of sovereignty. You may not expect the adversity that comes, but by knowing that He is sovereign and that He is good, there is no wasted adversity in your life. There's no such thing as blind fate. There's nothing that happens to the righteous, to the wise, to those who fear God. There is nothing that happens that is arbitrary, that has no purpose, that leads toward a good end. No, Solomon says, for the righteous, for the wise, for all of their dealings, they can rest in God's benevolent sovereignty. Charles Spurgeon picks this up in a different context, but he picks up the concept well when he writes this: there is no attribute more comforting to God's children than that of God's sovereignty. Under the most adverse circumstances, in the most severe trials, they believe that sovereignty has ordained their afflictions, that sovereignty overrules them, and that sovereignty will sanctify them all. There is nothing for which the children ought to more earnestly contend to than the doctrine of their master over all creation, the kingship of God over all the works of His own hands, the throne of God and His right to sit upon that throne, for it is God upon the throne whom we trust. It is important to begin here because, as we know, this is one of the most contested doctrines, even among professing Christians. And when I hear opposition to the doctrine of God's meticulous sovereignty, it makes me want to cry out, how could you live in a world that is resigned to chance? Or worse, a world that is under your own designs or the designs of evil ones. If God is not meticulously sovereign in sending the adversity, then there isn't the possibility of rest. Then you cannot trust that those circumstances have a good purpose. Then indeed, if God is not sovereign, then bad circumstances are just bad. Then the bent things of life are just bent. There's no redemptive value to them. But as Solomon calls upon us to do, he calls upon us to realize that for the righteous, for the wise, for those who fear God, everything in their lives, all their dealings are in His hands. And He is moving them like water. And because He is moving them, and because they are in His hand, He is moving them to a good end. Now that leads to the second lesson, the second matter And this is found in verses 2 through 6. Reflect upon the certainty of death. This certainly is related to what he has just stated about sovereignty and God's orchestration of the minutest details of life. God's orchestration extends to the moment of your death. This is what he says in verses 2 through 6. It is the same for all. There is one fate for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good, for the clean, and for the unclean, for the man who offers a sacrifice and for the one who does not sacrifice. As the good man is, so is the sinner. As the swearer is, so is the one who is afraid to swear. There is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that there is one fate for all men. Furthermore, the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil, and insanity is in their hearts throughout their lives. Afterwards, they go to the dead. For whoever is joined with all the living, there is hope. Surely a live dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know they will live, but the dead do not know anything. Nor have they any longer a reward, for their memory is forgotten. Indeed, their love, their hate, and their zeal have already perished, and they will no longer have a share in all that is done under the sun. Now, Solomon begins here by emphasizing that there is one fate that awaits all mankind, even the righteous and the wise. And he begins by listing the righteous as one of these categories. He lists 5 of them. Notice how he covers the entire spectrum here through this list of 5 descriptions, these antithetical descriptions. First of all, this one fate applies to the righteous and the unrighteous, to those who are law-abiding and to those who break the law. Same fate. To those, you could say, who pay their taxes and are outstanding citizens, who contribute to society, and those who are leeches. Same fate. To the man of integrity and to the murderer. Same fate. He goes on to say this, for the clean and the unclean, now referring specifically to even more religious aspects here, those who work hard at this point to follow the divine regulations of the Mosaic covenant, which God had instituted for the people of Israel. For those who work hard at that for God's glory, and as well as for those who don't care and defile themselves, the same fate. For the one who offers a sacrifice, for the one who does not sacrifice. For those who recognize the Mosaic allowances and prescriptions for recognizing and confessing sin, there are those who offer those sacrifices, and then there are those who break the laws, who don't offer sacrifices, don't confess their sin, and yet the same fate. He says, for the good man and for the sinner, the one who is morally upright and the one who is wicked, the same fate. The swearer of vows, probably a reference here to the one who makes loyal covenants and to the one who's afraid to swear, the one who doesn't keep his word. All of those, the whole spectrum, Solomon says there's one fate, one same fate. They all die. It's certain. You can't see any other option. And indeed, this is perplexing. It should be. It should be perplexing to us. It should cause us to ask why. And for Solomon, he even admits, he says, this is an evil. Verse 3, this is an evil in that all that is done under the sun, that there's one fate. It should cause us to ask the question, how can this possibly be? It's an evil, he calls it. And the best way to understand that is that it's a misery. It is a problem. How can we resolve this dilemma? But he gives us an answer for it in the words that follow. Middle of verse 3 provides us with the reason for why the one fate still applies to all. He says, the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. He's not saying some of them. He's not referring to the nations, the Gentiles. He is making a blanket statement. The hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. It reminds us, in fact, it's very reminiscent of the language of Genesis 6, verse 5, where in the generation that preceded the flood, the early generations of mankind, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. And God sent the flood and drowned probably millions of them. And yet the same problem remains. You could go to Romans chapter 3, verse 10. There's no one righteous, not even one. And moreover, Solomon says insanity is in their hearts throughout their lives. There's no one who achieves perfection in this life. There's no one whose mind actually functions in a completely true manner in this life. In fact, he calls it insanity. What he's referring to here is the reality of universal depravity. And he's saying, this is why men die. This is why all die. It's a reference back to Genesis 3, verse 19. From the dust you were taken, and to the dust you will return. It's a reference to Romans chapter 5, verse 12, that through one man sin entered the world, and therefore through that man, Adam, death entered and touched everyone. Or as Paul says in Romans chapter 6, verse 23, for the wages of sin is death. They must die. But he does go on to say this, it's not a hopeless case for us. He says in verse 4, for whoever is joined with all the living, there is hope. And he says in this interesting idiomatic fashion, he says, surely a live dog is better than a dead lion. What he's saying here is that so long as man is still alive, so long as it is still called today, there are opportunities. There are opportunities to reckon with the reality of death, to know that your sin will cause your death. To reckon with that reality, to seize the day, and to steward the life that you have been given, so long as you have breath, to steward it appropriately. So he's not just saying in some kind of nihilistic fashion, look, we're all going to die, it's pointless. No. He says, so long as you're still alive, there's hope. Reflect upon the certainty of death and teach it, and let it teach you some lessons. As David Gibson says, to be alive is to have the day of opportunity in our hands in a way that we do not have when we're dead. He uses this illustration of the dog and the lion. He says, better a live dog than a dead lion. Well, a dog in the ancient Near East, and particularly in Israel, a dog was despised. It's a mongrel. The dogs were those that they hated and would kill if they could. The dogs were the scavengers. They weren't the nice house domesticated animals that they are today. They hated dogs. The lion, on the other hand, was revered. But Solomon says, what good is it to be something that's revered and dead? It's far better to be that which is despised, but still alive. You have opportunity. Don't waste it. He goes on to explain further. He says, for the living know they will die. That's the benefit. When you're still alive and you've taken into account the reality of death, you know you have to give an account, and that helps. The dead do not know anything, nor have they any longer a reward, for their memory is forgotten. Indeed, their love, their hate, and their zeal, the most basic emotions and expressions of life, they've already perished, and they will no longer have a share in all that is done under the sun. Now, it's important to note here that Solomon is not trying here, and he's not intending to give us a theology of the afterlife. Ecclesiastes does refer to the afterlife briefly. For example, in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 17 and 11 verse 9, and then when we get to the very end of the book in 12 verse 14, he will refer to standing in judgment before God. But other than those instances, his emphasis is on stewardship of the present, living appropriately now. And so he uses this language to get us to focus on life under the sun, and he compares that with the life to come and says, look, you only have the opportunity now. You can't come back and redo it. You're not given the rewind button when you enter the grave. That's not how it works. Only one life that you have is the life that determines what happens later. The living man, therefore, has the advantage, particularly if he grasps these lessons, both here in the immediate context and the broader context of Ecclesiastes, because you know this then, that you will meet God as your judge, that you will give to God an account for your life, and you must steward your life well. That's what we are to receive from the reality of death. Those are the lessons that we must embrace. Now that leads to his third matter of death and life, and that is that we must rejoice in the gifts of life. Knowing that death is inevitable and it could happen at any time, life is not a guarantee, it's a breath. You're to treat it that way, so how do you steward your life in a way that enables you to glorify God and stand before him as a good steward? This is what Solomon gives us next in verses 7 through 10. He says this, "Go then, eat your bread in happiness and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works. Let your clothes be white all the time, and let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given to you under the sun. For this is your reward in life, and in your toil in which you have labored under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going." A great commission is given here in a very real sense. Go then, Solomon says. As one commentator states, this is a wake-up call. There's no time to waste. Stop your complaining, stop nursing your anger, stop brooding about your problems, get over your anxiety, end quote. In other words, yes, death is real. Man up. Don't be pitying yourself over that. Get a grip. As Walter Kaiser says, why should anyone then who truly fears God have the joy of life stolen out from under him because of the unresolved perplexity still remaining in the partially disclosed plan of God? Solomon is saying, look, even though there will be adversity and you will die and you can't even predict when, that does not in any way excuse you from not being joyful in this life. What we have in verses 7 to 9 here, as I stated already, is one of those carpe diem texts. Carpe diem means seize the day. And there's been several of these already. We saw one in 2, verse 24 through 26. Another one in chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. And in chapter 3, verse 22, we saw one in chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. And we'll see another one after this one in chapter 11, verses 7 through 10. Seize the day. And what we find is that in every one of these carpe diem statements, the intensity grows. Solomon becomes more and more direct. And what has been interesting so far is that Solomon, in the past carpe diem statements, uses a lot of better than statements. But here, he provides the most intense, the most directed carpe diem statement yet, and gives us a series of direct exhortations. One writer says it this way: preparing to die and die well does not mean drawing the curtains and dressing in black and thinking morbid thoughts. Preparing to die means thinking about how to live. That's what Solomon is doing here. Or as Charles Bridges stated, this is God's remedy. Go thy way. Enjoy your mercies while you have them. And when we look at 7 through 9, we see these particular exhortations. This is what we are to enjoy in life. Now, you could add probably many more to these, hundreds of more applications of these, but Solomon appears to take the most basic things of life and put them in categories and say, this is what you are to enjoy. He says, eat your bread in happiness. Eat your bread in happiness. In other words, enjoy sustenance. And notice he calls it bread. Now, certainly we can enjoy steak, and we should, but he's talking here about the most ordinary meal, your bread. Every time you sit down to eat, enjoy it. You're called to do that, to enjoy the sustenance that God has given you. He says, drink your wine with a cheerful heart. Enjoy the refreshment. Enjoy the refreshment that comes with the breakfast and the lunch and the dinner, the refreshment that comes through eating and drinking. He says, God has already approved your works, so enjoy labor. When he says that God has improved your works, what he's doing is not giving a carte blanche that you can then just do any kind of immoral or unjust work. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that if you have good labor to do, embrace it. God's given it to you. It's a gift. So embrace it. Enjoy your work. He says, let your clothes be white all the time. He's referring there to the opposite of the sackcloth and ashes. And you know that you would wear sackcloth and ashes. You'd dress in dark things and cover yourself with soot when you were mourning. And certainly back in chapter 3, he did acknowledge that there is a time to mourn. But as a general perspective on life, he says, let your clothes be white. Let them be those of celebration. Let them be those of comfort. He says, let not oil be lacking on your head. Oil is used in reference to blessing in Psalm 133. It's used in reference to gladness in Isaiah 61. It's something, again, which refreshes, but is particularly known. You put that oil on for times of celebration and gladness. Enjoy gladness. Enjoy fellowship. Being in good company. He says then, enjoy life with the woman who you love. Enjoy marriage. And in view here in particular is that one flesh union that is part of marriage. And so very, very different from Jerome and how Jerome emphasized celibacy and singleness as the highest. Solomon is saying, men, enjoy your wives. God has created that for your enjoyment. And you do that under the fear of God, and you enjoy that life with your wife, all the intimacy, and it's part of glorifying God. He's given it to you to enjoy, so enjoy it to his glory. And it's not only Solomon who says that. Even the Apostle Paul picks up on this, on the idea of enjoying bread and enjoying your wife. He says this in 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 to 4, as he dealt in his own time with that tendency towards asceticism. Now remember, the sinful approach to these things is always in extremes. So you either have the extreme of asceticism, which is sinful, or you have the sin of hedonism, which seeks to enjoy these things apart from God, without the fear of God, not controlled by the fear of God, but to enjoy these things merely for themselves. Rather, we are to enjoy these things fully under the umbrella of the fear of God. And Paul says this, 1 Timothy 4, But the Spirit explicitly says that in later times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, by means of the hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron. Men, now notice this, who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with gratitude, for it is sanctified by means of the Word of God and prayer. Or you could look at something so simple as the injunction in Psalm 118, verse 24, where we live our lives beginning in the mornings all the way through to the moment we put our head down on the pillow. And we say, this is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Solomon, back in Ecclesiastes 9, even adds this additional statement about work. Very important one as well. He says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there's no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going. Now here, Sheol probably is just a reference to the grave. He's using that term to refer to death. But again, his focus is not on a theology of the afterlife. He's looking at life right now and using the grave as a point of comparison. And he says, when you're in the grave, you can't do these things under the sun any longer. It's over forever. So while you have time, he says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. It's the call to be all in, to live life to the fullest, really to wear out rather than to rust out. And of course, this is assuming all the right reasons. Solomon has already looked at men who work endlessly for wrong motives. Solomon is clarifying that now and saying, look, God has given you work to enjoy. And as the children of God, you should be known as those who do everything with all your might. And the nature of the language here is that it's not just related to work, although it has primary application to that, but it does relate to everything like marriage, like raising children, like service to others. Do it with all your might. Run hard. The commission here is to use the gifts and opportunities that God gives you, whether great or small. It doesn't matter. There's no qualification given that you only run hard if it's a grandiose objective. No, whatever your hand finds to do. And it should be all of our motto as those who have studied this book, those who fear God, those who have been redeemed by Him through Jesus Christ. It should be our greatest objective that whatever we do it with a commitment to excellence. We put our heart into it. We leave nothing on the field. We go in. We pursue it. And we do it in a way of enjoying it. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, whether then you eat or drink, again, the most basic things of life that even babies do their first day, eating or drinking, whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. It should be something wherein when we go throughout the day and we accomplish our tasks, our objectives, our responsibilities, everything that God has given us, both in family, in the home, outside the home, at work, at church, wherever that is, that we have this drive. Not one that is motivated by guilt, not one that is trying to earn our way into heaven. No, this is a drive that is motivated by that adoration of God that motivates us to do our very best, whether it's stacking chairs or preaching a sermon. There's a hymn that I've never heard before, and I don't think anyone here has heard it. It's by Horatius Bonar, 19th century Presbyterian or Scottish preacher. And it's called Make Haste, O Man, to Live. And it captures so well what Solomon is teaching here in chapter 9, verses 7 to 10. It goes like this: Make haste, O man, to live, for thou so soon must die. Time hurries past thee like the breeze. How swift its moments fly. Make haste, O man, to live. Make haste, O man, to do whatever must be done. Thou hast no time to lose in sloth. Thy day will soon be gone. Make haste, O man, to live. Up then with speed and work, fling ease and self away. This is no time for thee to sleep. Up, watch, and work and pray. Make haste, O man, to live. Make haste, O man, to live. Thy time is almost o'er. O sleep not, dream not, but arise. The judge is at the door. Make haste, O man, to live. There's a fourth lesson that helps us understand the application of the one we just looked at. It's found in verses 11 to 12. We could certainly set a lot of expectations with our fulfillment of that Carpe Diem text, but Solomon reminds us once again, be careful about expectations. You can enjoy life and must enjoy life, but be careful of connecting your joy to expectations, because outcomes are uncertain, and your joy should not be connected to outcomes. And so our fourth point here is recognize the uncertainty of outcomes. There are no guarantees. Verses 11 to 12, I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability. For time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, man does not know his time. Like fish caught in a treacherous net and birds trapped in a snare, so the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. There's important lessons here to learn about outcomes. And he says this, he says time and chance, according to the translation that we have, but it's better rendered as occurrences and happenings. Occurrences, you could even say, as adversities, misfortunes, difficult circumstances. And then happenings refers to even accidents, unplanned problems. Occurrences and happenings overtake them all. And so he says this: the race is not to the swift. In other words, your speed isn't always going to win a race. He says the battle is not to warriors. Strength doesn't always win wars. Neither is bread to the wise. Wisdom isn't always successful, nor wealth to the discerning. Intelligence isn't always prosperous, nor favor to men of ability. Skill isn't always popular. He's telling us that we need to have appropriate expectations, and we need to expect that our investments in different activities of life and pursuits will not always achieve what we think they ought to. He says, moreover, man does not know his time. And this now is not just a reference to outcomes experienced in this life, but now he's speaking again of death. His time refers to the moment of his death. When it comes to a man's death, it typically arrives unexpected and undesired, much like the end of fish and birds. And he's ensnared at an evil time. Again, evil not in any way impugning God's sovereignty, but evil as in a miserable time, an unexpected time, a very unfavorable time for the individual. He's saying, make sure your expectations are limited. There's no guarantees. This reminds us even of what James says in James 4, doesn't it? Verses 13 through 16. Where James very much echoes the idea of Ecclesiastes 9, verses 11 to 12, when James says this: come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, We will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. And what James is talking about and what Solomon talks about is not simply appending onto your language, onto your speech, if the Lord wills, in some kind of ritualistic manner. It's about a mindset. It's not just about saying those words, if the Lord wills. It's about a mindset that says, I don't know what God's going to do with my life. I'm going to do this and do that. I'm going to do it with full recognition that God is sovereign. He has the right to do what he pleases. I'm going to fear him as I do these things. I'm going to enjoy what I do, but he has every right and may take it all away. I may not get the outcome that I expect, and that's okay. I love my God. He comes with a final lesson then for us in the final verses really quickly here. As he closes this particular section, he calls upon us to recall the parameters of wisdom. He reminds us in these final verses that as good as wisdom is, it's not the ultimate solution. He says this, "Also, this I came to see is wisdom under the sun, and it impressed me. There was a small city with a few men in it, and a great king came to it, surrounded it, and constructed large siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he delivered the city by his wisdom. Yet no one remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength. But the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. The words of the wise heard in quietness are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." Solomon here is turning our attention back to that topic of wisdom, and he's recalling some historical event that he had observed, perhaps in his father's kingdom, perhaps during his time of ruling, perhaps in another kingdom of a surrounding nation, and he draws several lessons from what he has just written. He says this, wisdom is indeed better than strength. It's better than authority. It's better to have wisdom than to have weapons. It's better to be wise than to be a loud king. But he also says, people don't often recognize the benefit of wisdom. It's not going to be widely acclaimed. There's limitations to wisdom. It's not something that's attractive to everybody. You just need to know that. And then thirdly, he says folly can undo it all. You can be wise, you can have good planning and ascribe good things to the people around you, and yet one bad apple in the mix can undermine it all. Indeed, wisdom is better, but understand this, it's not the solution to everything. It has its limits. People are fickle, and folly is contagious. Once again, wisdom is not the ultimate remedy. Charles Bridges puts it this way, learn to estimate men by their wisdom and godliness, not by their outward show. Value wisdom as the gift of God. The more we feel our need of the gift, the more stimulating must be our earnest pleading for the continued supply. But learn also to prepare for disappointment. Work for the best interests of your fellow creatures, but not for their appropriation or reward. Let not their praise be our motive. Wisdom has parameters. It has limits. Now, as we close, I want to leave you with a couple of final exhortations which really follow what we've already seen before. Number one, man, don't waste your life. Don't waste your life. If you knew what would happen to you tomorrow, it would certainly change what you would do right now. But that's what Solomon is trying to do here. He's trying to say you could die tomorrow. So don't waste your life on distractions. Embrace the important things. Then number two, focus on that which is important, knowing that you will die. Live for that which is important. Have that as the priority that guides your life, and and is used in your making of decisions. Number 3, enjoy then life with all your might. If you've recognized the priorities, then pursue those priorities. But the problem is often we have that gut feeling that our priorities aren't right, and so it's not right to pursue them. That's the problem. Change the priorities. Your life ought to be one of running hard, of giving yourself all you've got. Not, again, motivated by guilt, not motivated by wrong, sinful motives before the Lord, but rather recognizing the opportunities He's given you. Run hard. Enjoy that life. And then, of course, orient everything around God's glory. You want to be in His hands as you do this. That righteous one, that wise one. And who is that one? It's the one who fears Him, who has that faith, that adoration that compels him to run to God as his only Redeemer, his only hope, and the giver of all these good gifts and the enabler of joy. Let's pray that the Lord would make us this kind of men. Father, we are grateful that you have not put us in a world that's material and physical in nature, to dangle things in front of us as snares. Instead, the things that you have made are good. The things that you created, that you designed and provide to us are good things. We confess that so often we fall onto either side of the road, into either ditch, either that of asceticism, where we seek discomfort for discomfort's sake, thinking that that will please you, or the other side where we fall into seeking pleasure merely for pleasure's sake and idolize those pleasures. Keep us on this road of receiving from you the opportunities and gifts of life, enjoying them as those who consecrate these things to your glory and who are influenced through and through by our fear of you, that both motivates us to turn everything toward your glory, but also at the same time to steward it well. And if you have given these things to us for our enjoyment, we pray that you'd enable us to do just that, to enjoy. We ask these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.